Welcome, everyone. That was Las Cafeteras. It's movement time. So we're glad to start with some energy from Las Cafeteras. If you don't know them, check them out. And thank you for all the knowledge they started us off with today.
Let's go ahead to the next slide, and I believe Oscar and Dave will be our moderators for today. Oscar, Dave, welcome. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you all. My name is Dave Brown. I'm the Senior Associate for School-Based Training and Behavioral Health Equity at Central East MHTTC, and happy 2/22/22. Can't think of a better place than to be with everybody right here, right now. So thank you for being here. Culturally Sustaining and Healing Centered Pedagogy, if I said that right. Please take a moment and in the chat room, type your voice. Let us know who you are, what role you play in supporting mental health, personally, professionally, and where are you joining us from? Where are you sitting right now? The more we know about each other, the more we build community. Take that minute. Cortland, New York, West Virginia, Hawaii, Virginia. So communities can be next door, in the next county, the next state, the next country. All right. I love hearing who you are professionally, but don't forget the counselors, department heads, teachers are all people too. So don't forget who you are is not just who your title is. All right. So next, today's tech logistics. As always, please keep your mics on mute when you're not speaking. And if you're moving around, like I have 2 COVID dogs, and they're in the way, you can turn off your video. But when you're present, be present, because your presence is your power. All right. And if you want to use closed captioning, you click on the 2 C's on the bar at the bottom of your screen. If you have a link or resource you'd like to share or questions for the group, use the chat. It really is the best option. All right. We may have an attempt to make today's presentation, we've made an attempt to make today's presentation secure. If we need to end the presentation unexpectedly, we will follow up with you using a registration email, the email that you provided when you registered. If you have any technical issues, just text us privately and we will do everything we can to make it right and make it work. Again, your presence is your power. Use your voice, whether you speak it, type it, if you need to, sign it, whatever it is, don't let your voice go unknown, unheard. Next, we'd like to welcome you to the MHTTC network. After today's session, we suggest that you visit our website and find your regional center to keep in touch with us for more resources and training opportunities, all free of cost. Always a key word. If it's free, I will take 2. So please, no coupons necessary. Our disclaimer, you guys can read this from my teaching days. The presentation was prepared by the MHTTC network under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. The opinions expressed in this learning session are the views of our moderator and panelists and do not necessarily reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services, or SAMHSA. All right. Our goal is to build a network of support, a community among school communities that strengthens our capacity to lead in challenging racial violence while forging school cultures and climates of healing and wellness. All right, so we are Tuesday again, 2/22/22, makes it easier and fun to say. This is just one of several sessions, and we really encourage you to attend all of them and lend your person and your voice to each part of the community that we build. All right. Our network uses and encourages all to use affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language in our trainings and events. A reminder that as we engage in a conversation today, let us be mindful to use language that is inclusive and accepting of diverse cultures, genders, perspectives, and experiences. I have the great pleasure to introduce and hand the baton off to Jerica Coffey, who teaches English and Ethnic Studies, Coliseum College Prep in East Oakland, and is working to grow the next generation of critically conscious educators throughout City College of San Francisco's Teacher Prep program. Jerica, thank you for being here, and I pass the baton.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you everyone for making the time and space to be here with us this afternoon. I feel really humbled to be able to be part of this community, and I've learned so much in the time that we've had and the sessions that we've had together. So I hope to have something to offer this community on behalf of the people that I serve, and I'm excited to be here with you. So I want to begin by sharing a little bit about what today might feel like for participants. So some parts of this time that we have together will be a lot of input where I'm sharing frameworks and theories and ways that those live in classroom life for me. But I'm also going to stop at different points in time for us to generate meaning together. And so today might feel like there's a lot of questions being raised around how what I'm sharing about culturally sustaining practices and healing-centered engagement, how it lands for your own context. And it might also feel like what I'm sharing complicates solutions that you're trying in your own context. And that might be because a lot of what I'm going to share with you today is grounded in my local context. So the invitation is to take what resonates and makes sense and leave behind what doesn't. But to also be open and stretch ourselves to think about relevance, right? To think about what can be brought into your practice and into your spaces, whatever those might be, whether they're classrooms or school-based clinics or whatever space you might be working with young people and families or children. And so I'm going to start, as I mentioned, by talking about context, which makes sense because if we're talking about community sustaining and culturally sustaining practices, we have to talk about context. That's the work where the work is grown from. As I mentioned, I'm going to share some theoretical frames that have informed my work with children and families over the years. And then I'm going to ground what I have to share in actual curriculum and pedagogy that I've been developing over some years, and you'll get a chance to take a look at student work and how this lives in classroom life. And my hope is that I'm able to really make concrete how healing-centered engagement overlaps with culturally sustaining practices and how that can live in classroom life. I think for myself as an educator, sometimes I come into learning spaces and things aren't concrete enough for me to understand how to implement it in my classroom, even though the ideas are important. And so I hope to offer some concrete ways that these practices can live in school-based settings. And then at the end of our session, we'll be similar to the last session, doing a case study similar to, or addressing some similar questions and problems that arise when we're trying to implement a culturally sustaining or healing-centered pedagogy. And we'll do some problem solving together using the same heuristic of the bioecological model, just like last session as well. And then we'll close out. So that's our agenda for our time. And so I know for myself, I just came from 4 back-to-back classes that started at 8, but my day started at 5 in the morning preparing for that. So for me to come into this space where my thinking is going to get more expansive, I know grounding is important. So I want to lead us through a few grounding exercises to connect with a sense of purpose for why we're here. And so the invitation right now is, if you're sitting or standing, to pay attention to and kind of drop down into your bodies. And if it makes sense, to close your eyes and focus your attention inward. And I want to invite everyone to feel the ground underneath their feet, and to feel the earth supporting them. Maybe you wiggle your toes, but to feel your connection to the earth, to the floor, and to support. And I want to begin this grounding exercise with a land acknowledgement, because as we think about healing school communities from racial violence, that work in my mind needs to be grounded in the root causes of violence in our communities. And so land acknowledgement, although sometimes it feels performative to me, I wanted to share the words of Clint McKay, who always reminds me that there's a purpose for it, no matter what it does. When we acknowledge the land that we sit on, the original peoples of the land where we live and work, the ways that we benefit from their stewardship of that land, that we are acknowledging the effects of colonization. And so I'm here with you all from Wichin, the land of the Lishan Ohlone people. And this is the land that belongs to the Lishan, it's unceded Ohlone territory. And the Lishan Ohlone are still here, and they speak the Chocheño language. I stand in solidarity with all Indigenous people and their right to self-determination and justice. And I recognize that, the treaty rights of those people. I commit to working toward healing the effects of generational trauma, theft, and dispossession of Native people's land. And I will continue to support the needs of the Indigenous community where I live. And so, keeping your eyes closed, the invitation is to connect with the land that you're sitting on, and to offer words of support or solidarity to the Indigenous people of the land where you live, of the land where you work. And I want to bring our attention from there to your breath, settling into the body with a few deep breaths in and out. And I'd like for you now to bring up the image of a child or a parent or a young person in your community with whom you have a special relationship. And I'd like for you to imagine them in your mind's eye, sitting before you. And as you get a clear picture of them sitting before you, imagine that they have a big smile on their face. Imagine them at peace. And then imagine them surrounded with a field of loving energy. And that this field of loving energy is feeding and nourishing them, their mind, their body, their spirit. And now imagine that this energy field of nourishing, loving energy is connected to you. is surrounding you. And send them a prayer of loving kindness as you stay connected to them for a few breaths in this way. May you be happy. May you be safe. May you be free from inner and outer harm. And now I'd like to invite you to come back into the room, opening your eyes, maybe wiggling your fingers and toes. And as you bring your energy and attention back to the screen, the invitation is for you to put your hand over your heart and to say thank you. Thank you for taking the time to show up for the communities that you serve in this way, to continue to expand learning on behalf of the people that you care about in your work. Okay. So thank you for engaging in that grounding exercise. Trying to do a grounding exercise on Zoom is like, it's not something I'm very comfortable with. So thank you for entertaining that. I think it's important. And I know it's important for me to orient myself to purpose when we do this work together. So I want to begin by telling you a little bit about myself. And I want to make the disclaimer that what I'm going to share with you, these ideas are my own. They certainly are informed by the communities that I'm a part of, and they're built on the work of amazing scholar activists. But a lot of what I'm going to share around curriculum is my own work. And so I'm not here representing any of these organizations or institutions, but they inform my practice. So I'm entering my 22nd year of working in public education. Currently, I teach ethnic studies and English in East Oakland, in Oakland Unified at a school called Coliseum College Prep. I also am on the faculty at City College of San Francisco in the teacher prep program. I work with dual enrollment students who are interested in education as a pathway. And then I also do work to build out teacher prep pipelines out of community colleges to try to diversify our workforce. And then I'm also on the teacher leadership committee for a pilot program that we're doing in Oakland Unified, trying to build out ethnic studies content across the K-12 pipeline. And then there's an organization I want to mention that I was a part of that we started in 2012 that has really informed my thinking about healing-centered engagement, and that is the People's Education Movement. And People's Ed is a space where it's an autonomous collective space that was, at the time when we began the organization, was interested in figuring out how we could create liberatory spaces both inside and outside of the classroom that would promote growth and healing and transformation. And so it was in this space that I first became exposed to this idea of, I was trained in ethnic studies, but not really accessing or engaging with this idea of healing. And it was through inquiry groups, teacher inquiry groups and People's Ed that I began to consider the ways as a literacy educator, a literacy education could be expanded to incorporate healing practices. And so what I'm going to share with you was born out of the People's Ed teacher inquiry group space. And so I want to begin with some assumptions that I hold as a literacy educator. The first is that we should not really give a lot of credence to the binary that relevance does not lead to rigor, that we have to sacrifice one for the other. In my experience, when things are relevant to students, the rigor comes, right? Because there's deeper engagement and there's more meaningful learning. The second assumption is that our students come to us engaged in complex literacy practices. And so it's really the art of teaching to figure out how to use those existing literacy practices for deeper learning and academic learning that we want them to do in the classroom. I also make the assumption that all teachers are literacy teachers. So if we see literacy in this more expansive way, and we think about it in terms of being able to read and recreate the world, we're all literacy teachers in our various domains. So it's something important to pay attention to for all folks working with, in my mind, children and families. And then the last and perhaps most important assumption that I do this work under is that literacy has and will continue to be integral to our struggle for liberation. It's the birthright that we hold as people of color. And I want to always figure out ways to orient my students towards this larger purpose for literacy learning. So I'm going to be sharing some content that I've developed that I think really embodies how healing-centered practices can live in the classroom. But I want to first spend some time sharing about the context that I developed this work in. And so I taught for 5 years in South Los Angeles in a community called Watts. And it's a community that has a long history of resistance to institutional oppression, right? So when we think about the 1965 Watts uprisings and the 1992 Los Angeles uprisings in response to, in both cases, in response to police violence, but historical disinvestment, systemic racism. And my students were living under multiple stressors, right? So you can see this list, but I could make slide after slide after slide of the conditions that young people were coming up in that were incredibly challenging. Another thing I want to mention that informed my thinking around this kind of curriculum is the community in South Los Angeles at the time was experiencing majorly shifting demographics, which were creating certain kinds of social dynamics that I wanted to address in my classroom. And so it's sort of embodied here in this mural. This image, you can see there's a picture of Martin Luther King, there's a picture of Obama, and then there's also a picture of the first indigenous president in Mexico, right? So you can see this like mixing of cultures here, but there's an aspect of this dynamic, this influx of new migration from Central America that was happening at the same time that the African-American and Black communities were being sort of pushed out of the community for a range of different reasons. And so I pulled this from a local paper. A community member was talking about this sort of disorientation that was happening for Black folks at the time. And they said that the main problem is that Black people, as they decline in number and percentages, as the old Black demographic of the central city becomes ever more Latino, Blacks are becoming invisible politically, socially, and civically. And while this person doesn't speak for everybody that lives in South LA, you could feel these dynamics in the community. And it was manifest in my school site at the time in these instances of racialized violence where that were incredibly challenging and complex to unpack. And so what I would, in the curriculum I'm going to share, what I'm directly trying to do is create an intervention around that kind of racialized violence. That one part of it, right, one part of that root is a community becoming disoriented, disenfranchised, and then sort of experiencing this shift of identity and almost a sense of erasure. And so what I started to consider was, how could I create a curriculum that would build on students' assets, right? So I just went through all of these challenges that young folks were facing before they entered my classroom. But that's not the whole story of who they are, right? They had all these incredible assets that they were bringing with them into the classroom. And I came to understand that any curriculum that wasn't building on those assets to allow young folks to address the needs in the community, these very urgent needs, any curriculum that was taking them away from this was a sort of morally bankrupt endeavor in my mind. And so, as I mentioned at the time, through people's education work, I started to get exposed to this idea of healing in the classroom and what that might mean. And so I want to share the Sean Ginwright's framework for healing-centered engagement and kind of unpack a few of these before we get into the curriculum, because I find his work to be incredibly useful. It's generally free of jargon, and as an educator, right, a classroom teacher, this is really helpful, or it has been for me. So he talks about how healing-centered engagement is explicitly political rather than clinical. In other words, it addresses, right, power and the root causes of racism, sexism, homophobia, etc., right? The root causes of harm. He talks about how it's culturally grounded and views healing as a restoration of identity. And I'll unpack this in just a moment. But this is important when we think about curriculum in the classroom. You know, what are the ways that our content, what students are learning, takes them through a process of restoring a sense of identity and belonging. And then he also talks about how healing-centered engagement is asset-driven, and it focuses not on the pathology, right, or the trauma, but more on the assets that students or families possess that allows them to survive, that allows them to resist, that allows them to be resilient. And then last, he talks about how healing-centered engagement supports adult providers with their own healing. And this last one, I'm not going to get into in this workshop, but I have offered, there's an article about a space that I was part of for some time called Hella here in Oakland, and it'll be in the Jamboard, and the work of Dr. Farima Porkoshed around creating spaces for teachers to heal collectively, I think is really important work. So I'm not going to get into that, but that has also been a part of my journey as well. Okay, so I want to unpack a few of these pillars of healing-centered engagement, and then talk a little bit about how I see them overlapped with community sustaining or culturally sustaining pedagogy. So when Ginwright talks about healing-centered engagement as explicitly political rather than clinical, he's talking about how, for me as a teacher, I'm seeing it as, you know, I'm developing curriculum and experiences with students that allow them to develop an awareness about the conditions, the material conditions of their lives that cause trauma, and that I'm allowing them to have experiences and build the will and the skill to engage in work for change. And this is important, right? Because what we know about trauma is that it robs us of feeling a sense of agency, power, and control in our lives. So the more we create spaces in our classrooms where students have agency and control and can directly effectuate change in the conditions of their lives, the more that we create the capacity for healing. And I want to bring in the work of Theresa Perry here. She wrote an amazing essay in the book, Young, Gifted, and Black. And she talks about how, at the beginning of the essay, how, you know, why we shouldn't be surprised when students resist in our classrooms, especially if we're not offering them a curriculum that can directly impact the conditions that are oppressive in their lives. So she writes, why should one focus on learning in school if that learning does not have the capacity to affect, inform, or alter one's perception or status as a member of an oppressed group? And while my students weren't coming into my classroom, articulating like this, when they understood, right? There was a wisdom that they held when something did not feel relevant, didn't feel like it was going to immediately benefit their lives in some way. I was seeing disengagement. And so I had to really think about what am I doing that is going to create the context for, again, the assets that they're bringing with them into the classroom are being used as tools to address the need. And so, as I mentioned before, I'm trained in ethnic studies. And so you can see the overlap here, right? For me, healing-centered engagement is overlapping with ethnic studies pedagogy because it, again, develops a critical lens. Students have these lenses that they can put on to make sense of the oppression they experience, right? But as Wright talks about it in his book, The Four Pivots, you can't just give young people the lens, right? Because they also need the mirror. They need the space to reflect on the impact of racism, of sexism, of homophobia, whatever form of oppression that is impacting their lives. They need to be able to understand the impact on the mind, on the heart. And so ethnic studies, because it's really grounded in counter narratives that are community responsive and humanizing, is a pedagogy as well as a content, right? A focus on content that offers us what we can consider a remembering, right? So schooling at it, in the United States, one thread of it has always been the process of assimilating, right? Or cultural dismemberment for communities of color. And so ethnic studies, what it helps us do is it helps us engage in a cultural remembering or bringing together, identity building, right? Exploration of self. And so for me, you can see there's this overlap. And so in ethnic studies pedagogy, and there's a beautiful piece called Towards an Ethnic Studies Pedagogy that articulates all of these pieces better than I am right now. So I encourage folks to check it out. But this overlap of healing-centered engagement with ethnic studies, pedagogy, and framework for me makes sense. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a moment in the classroom. Okay, so I already spoke to this. I wanna, before we take a break to kind of see where everyone's at with this, I wanna offer one more thing around literacy, the purpose for literacy education. And so in that same piece that I referenced, Theresa Perry talks about how in the Black radical tradition, you pursued learning because that's how you asserted yourself as a free person and how you claimed your humanity. And you pursued learning because you were working toward the racial uplift and the liberation of your people, and you were preparing to lead your people. And so in the curriculum that I'm going to share, I want to ask that you consider how is what students are engaging in orienting them toward this sense of purpose, which again, I want my students to see as their birthright. It's the history of how our people have engaged in education. And so I want them to understand that and to figure out ways to have that be embodied in my classroom practice. So I know that was a lot and it was all input. So I would like for us to take a few minutes, and I want to ask that people get in the chat. And we won't have time to answer all these questions, but just so that we're engaging and we're seeing how we're making meaning collectively, what's resonating so far? What are some questions this is raising? What are some takeaways that you're pulling from the workshop so far? So I see providing an emotionally corrective experience. I see how do you work with trauma in your classroom. I see the importance of collective healing and using ethnic studies to ground clinical work. Yeah, I see how is what I'm teaching helping students take action towards their own liberation. Yes. Vocabulary shifting. Yes. Grounding in the historical and social context. Possibility, not pathology. Love it. Thank you, folks. Yeah, I see a great question that's going to come up again toward the end of our time together when we're going to be thinking about a problem of practice, right? How do you do this and get, administrators to be open? So we'll talk about that for sure. Yes, okay. All right, so thank you, everyone. We can keep it going in the chat, and thank you for that. So now I'm going to get into classroom practice, curriculum, and pedagogy through one unit that I developed while I was teaching in Watts. And it's my effort, my humble offering to concretize the bridging of ethnic studies frameworks with healing-centered pedagogy, right? Or healing-centered engagement. So in this unit that I'm going to share, I called it the Community Cultural Wealth Project, where students were asked to research and develop counter stories of resilience and resistance that would highlight untold, unsung sheroes and heroes and folks in our communities that students felt had a story to be told. And so this is a picture of my board, one of the first times I taught this unit, and I asked students, I put the word Watts up and we did a semantic map. What are all the words you associate with Watts? And this is all, words students came up with. And if you take a look at this, you can see how students have internalized a deficit lens, a deficit narrative about their community. Aside from the words revolution and family, most of everything else on here is rather negative and deficit. And so part of this learning in this unit was about reframing and creating counter narratives about Watts that challenge this dominant narrative about who students thought they were, who students thought, or how they came to think about their communities. And I'm drawing here from Tara Yoso's work on counter stories. She talks about how counter narratives are the narratives that give voice to the experiences of those at the margins. And so there are three questions, guiding questions or essential questions that guided my work in this unit with young folks that we came back to at the end of every week after we, do a set of readings or engage in some aspect of the project. And so these were sort of the frames for the unit. And so the first is, what are the different ways people respond to historical and generational trauma? And so they learn about those concepts in this unit. And they think about how storytelling can lead to healing both personally and collectively. So how narrative is part of healing. And then the last question that they think about is how research can be used to effectuate change in the community. And so here is the unit at a glance. I'm going to walk you through all these parts so that you can see how it developed. The unit begins with some model texts where we're looking at different kinds of writing that's been used as a healing modality. And then we also look at narrative journalism. So how do people take research and interviews that they've done and then create coherent narratives? And then students determine a person that they want to study, who they feel has an important life that they want to uplift in our community showcase. And they do research and learn how to work with interviews to put together written narratives that are based on these oral histories that they gather from folks in the community. And then we do a community showcase at the end, where we invite the community in and we highlight stories of resilience and resistance that students are gathering as they do their research. So I want to talk about a few pieces before we get into our case study time. So the unit begins by having students consider how writing can be used as a healing modality. And we work with 3 texts. The first is Trayvon Martin's mother wrote, I don't know if folks are familiar with this, but she wrote a piece in Time magazine that's a letter to Michael Brown's mother. And it's an incredible letter of solidarity and grief. But we use the letter to think about how a letter in solidarity with somebody who's experienced some kind of institutional harm, the way that Trayvon mothers did, how that could lead to healing. And then students also read a letter that from another unit that I taught. A student wrote to her mother posthumously, who died of an overdose, and she talks to her mother about all the things that she wished she could say. And so we read that letter to talk about how writing can be a tool for grief work, right? How even when we write to a loved one who's passed, how that can be part of our healing journey. And then they read a letter that I wrote to institutions, to one particular institution that harmed my family in a very profound way. And through that process of reading my letter, we talk about how accountability is part of healing process. For accountability, even if we don't get the accountability we want, holding institutions accountable publicly, for me, has been part of my own grieving process. And it's sort of embedded in a lot of these other readings. And so there's an academic purpose to it too that I want to mention in terms of the kinds of reading and writing that we want them to do. But this is how we set the frame for writing as a tool for healing. Okay. We also read Nicole Leblanc's Random Family.
What time are you in now?
Let's see. We also read Nicole Leblanc's Random Family, which is, she's a journalist, a white journalist who embedded herself in a Puerto Rican community for 10 years and interviews generations of a few families. And she puts together this narrative. And so we read it both with the grain and against the grain, both as a way to critique outsider perspectives of communities of color, but also to learn the conventions of narrative writing. And then we read a chapter from Tara Yoso's book called Critical Race Counterstories Along the Chicano-Chicana Pipeline. And so they learn what counterstories are from Tara Yoso's work. And then they also learn the theory of community cultural wealth, which folks are probably familiar with, so I won't go too much into it. But just to say that this is an asset-based theory that is really accessible to students. And what it does is it helps us think about all the ways that communities of color resist in a society. What are the qualities, sensibilities, behaviors that allow us to resist and remain resilient in a society that was designed to destroy us? And so I laugh, but it's, you know, it's really sort of the way I present it to students. Every institution in our society was designed for other communities. How do we survive, right? And so this kind of framing is useful, and students then present to each other. Oh, I'm missing a slide. Oh no, here. Okay, so then I have students present their personal community cultural wealth to each other, where they identify all the different forms of community cultural wealth in their life, and they present to each other. And this is really critical because what we're doing is building a culture of vulnerability and allowing us to develop Indigenous knowledge in the sense that, you know, this student is talking about watching their mother get onto a roller skating rink after 10 years of living with MS, and the knowledge that they pulled from that, the way that allows them to orient themselves toward life. And so this incredible sharing about how our people, our resilience starts to build. And there's a lot of vulnerability in the process as we tell stories about who we are. And then students from here start developing their research projects. So they use the framing or the framework of community cultural wealth, and they develop questions to begin an interview process of a person in the community they feel has a story they need to be told, a counter story that they want to highlight at our community exhibition. Students then bring their interviews into the classroom, and I teach them how to code their interviews for generative themes. And then we use storyboarding to build coherent narratives, and they create a way for presenting and highlighting and uplifting that community member's life. And so oftentimes these are in the form of a poem, a written narrative, a digital presentation that layers sound with image. And at this presentation of learning, you can see here, you know, the first year I did it, we packed the auditorium. I had 130 students. And so we did it over several nights, and every night our auditorium was packed because they invited the people whose stories were being told into the community space, into the school space. And what this did for our community at the time is it was the first time that stories were being told that people had not heard about each other, right? And this again is in a community where what we were seeing is instances of racialized violence, a lot of mistrust and misunderstanding in the community. And here there was this event where young folks were highlighting and uplifting stories of surviving illness and loss, of surviving war, of immigration, of movement, life in the movement and life in struggle. And so these narratives, these counter narratives that they were building were incredibly powerful for us to have access to as a community, because it was restorying or allowing us to remember a sense of collective solidarity, a collective identity. And this was really one part of healing some of the fragmentation and division that we were experiencing on our campus at the time. And so I just want to share, as we transition into the case study space, that my learning from this kind of pedagogy and kind of curriculum is that research in this way, right, when it's built around finding counter stories and uplifting counter stories, affords us a sense of agency while we're also learning, you know, all the academic literacy skills that we want students to walk away with in our classrooms. That counter storytelling is a tool for both personal and collective transformation as our identities begin to shift from deficit to empowered, right? These projects that students were creating were in direct response to that deficit narrative that they begin, you know, that I showed you my board at the beginning of the unit, that they begin to unpack through these more expansive narratives about who lives in our community and who we are. And then the last thing I'll share is that in my experience, rigor increases when the work is authentic, when it has an authentic purpose and an authentic audience, and it really humanizes who we are to each other. And that when we're engaging students in inquiry around what's in their communities and in their lives, powerful learning follows. And so I want to just close with that, because I know we need to transition into our case study. But I also want to just mention that as we close, I've mentioned a few different pieces that I want to let folks know are in the Jamboard. And I think this session, the Jamboard starts, I think I wrote it down on page 14. So you'll see that there's some resources if you want to learn any more about some of the things I've referenced, that's available to you. So with that, let's take pause again before we transition into our case studies. And so if folks can drop in the chat, what's resonating, what questions are arising, how did this land for you, learning about this kind of classroom practice and pedagogy. Yeah, we'll be sharing the Jamboard link in just a moment. Great. I see some comments about collective storytelling as a powerful tool, intentional curriculum design, humanizing work, empowering voices, results, getting better results when it's meaningful. I see the Jamboards in there. I see a question about, can this be integrated into our classes? Does it have to be a separate course? Yeah. So I think this next, I'll share that as a last, and thank you for that question, because I think we're going to problem solve around this. There's been a few questions about how do you get people to support this kind of work in schools? How can it be integrated into a range of different kinds of spaces? And so I think that that's a great lead into the question or problem of practice that we're going to collectively solve. So I want to launch us into that. So we're going to be doing a case study that is going to engage us in an inquiry around similar issues. And so when you get, so I'll go over the case study and I'll answer any clarifying questions. And we're going to do breakout rooms where you'll have a chance to introduce yourself. And the ask is that you identify a note taker who can put or document people's ideas on the Jamboard. And again, the Jamboard is in the chat. I see even more questions coming about how do you get buy-in, right? And that's what we're going to be thinking about. There'll be a discussion moderator in the space with you who will be posing 3 questions, and you'll have about 15 minutes to talk about those questions. And then when we return to the full group, we're going to be sharing out some of the takeaways from those small group discussions. So I won't go into this in detail because this heuristic you already had access to in the last session, but this is the bioecological model. And so this model just asks us to think about the problem, or to, in this more complex way, thinking about how it could be addressed at the individual or interpersonal level, the community level, within our systems, policies, or institutions, and then thinking about it more broadly, ideologically, culturally, thinking about history, legacy, and structure. So when you're talking about the problem that I'll present to you in just a moment, the invitation is to use this as a heuristic to think about and discuss ways to approach addressing the problem. Okay, so here's the case study. So you're a third year, imagine that you're a third year teacher in a large comprehensive high school, and your curriculum planning team consists of veteran educators. And there's a sort of unspoken rule or culture that this curriculum should be the same across the grade level. And the curriculum, for the most part, is developed by others in the team. And the idea is that they're trying to shoot for standardization, right? We're all teaching the same. The curriculum is largely Eurocentric, textbook heavy, and lacking relevance to your students' lives. You find it difficult to teach with confidence and students are very disengaged. Okay, that's our problem of practice. So let's start with just any clarifying questions. I'll leave that. So I'll leave this up so you can take a minute to process it. But what are some clarifying questions folks need before they get into their breakout rooms? Need to have answered.
I have a question.
Yes.
At this school, are they allowed to make curriculum changes without board approval?
Yeah, I mean, I think imagine that, and that's a great question, but imagine that the culture is unspoken, right? And so, you know, within the standards, so this isn't saying like changing the standards, but the approaches to teaching whatever standards, and, you know, we can think about situate this in whatever content area, but the approaches and what students are reading and writing about, it, you know, there's an unspoken culture that it's the same across, you know, so I hope that is clear. So we're not talking about changing the standards necessarily, but the way those standards get approached, because even the content I just presented, that's all standards based, right? But it looks different in that classroom that I worked in than other classrooms, right? So the unspoken norm in this case study is that everyone teaches the same, and that the sort of veteran teachers are holding the culture and the paradigm, right? And it's largely Eurocentric, it's textbook heavy, and it lacks relevance. Other questions?
Yes, I had a question. I put it in the chat. I'm wondering, do I, as this third-year teacher, have allies on the curriculum planning team?
Yeah, so let's pose that as part of our problem solving, right? How would we build allies? You know, maybe assume that you don't now, but, you know, how would you problem solve around building that? Because I think, you know, inherent in that question is that's part of the solution, is definitely going to be trying to build allies. And how do you do that in a context like this? What are the things you need to know, and what are the things you need to engage in? Thank you for that. Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, so I'm going to ask that we go ahead and move into our case study spaces. And again, if you can introduce yourself, if you can decide on a note taker, and the facilitator in there will be posing some questions to move your conversation along. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for staying with us. I know my group had a rich dialogue around that problem of practice that was really powerful. And so just, we want to take a few minutes here to have some whole group reflection. What did folks hear that was helpful as you problem solved around that problem of practice of this unspoken culture around the Eurocentric curriculum that is disengaging to the young folks that you work with? How did folks think about addressing the dilemma? You could put your commentary in the chat, or folks can unmute themselves. What were some takeaways from that session of problem solving?
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to read off of some ideas that my group members had. So when we were discussing this, a lot of us had many ideas about how we can go about changing, or at least persuading the school to be able to implement this kind of curriculum that isn't so Eurocentric as it was proposed in the case study. Some things that we talked about was, one, like finding out what we can agree on with, with teachers, with faculty, with admin, where is essentially everyone at, and seeing how we can bridge those gaps together, using research on how students are being affected. A lot of what we're talking about is like safety, showing how like Black and Brown students are experiencing certain challenges, and hopefully that could be like a way that can show the curriculum team or the folks that are deciding the curriculum that we do need to implement something that does focus more on their realities. We also discussed on using like school demographics and their backgrounds, and the fact that there's such a variety of our experiences. However, also like the connection and like the similarities between those, even if they're different, it shows that students, because of this variety, it makes sense that we need to implement something that can speak on different perspectives and realities of our students. Another thing we talked about was more on like stating like the consequences again, like I mentioned earlier, but this time like also focusing on how like some of these consequences or the impacts that students face is lack of like agency, a voice, lack of identity. These are things that they're I think Jerika, you mentioned earlier, like we kind of, our identities and our experiences essentially get erased from not being able to talk about those realities. And then also just showing like the benefits that this could have on students. And I think that was hopefully everything. If some of my folks or the people in my group want to mention as well or add on to that, feel free. But yeah, that was our thoughts on the case study.
Thank you, Gabby. And I think that we have time for maybe one more person to unmute themselves and share out.
My name is Angela Jackson. I am from group 7. And so I'm going to read what our group came up with in the chat. I think I'm in the right group, but I'm not for certain. So what I will share is what I can remember about what we talked about in our breakout. Hold on just a minute. I see that it flipped to a different, but what we talked about was, in this, we talked about the experiences with not just diversity in the community, but not just diversity in the community, but also community, what is the community's, environmental type perspectives, and what is their strengths in the community that can be brought into the classroom, that can be contributed to the curriculum. And so one example was that there was a community of seniors who, have a big impact on the community, and there has been an impact on them by, the struggles with the pandemic, and how that can carry into the classroom and have an effect on the students and how they learn, and how can that their environmental concerns be used to help with their educational process in that process. And so what is important is, how does the curriculum more relate to that community, and keeping them engaged and keeping them actually learning based on their levels. And one person talked about, having working with special needs individuals, and with having a across the board curriculum, how can you incorporate a better way for those special needs individuals to learn based on their learning, their levels of learning.
Thank you for that. And I think I want to uplift something someone said in the group that I was a part of around like really understanding, and it speaks to what's just been shared, but understanding the landscape of the context, right? And also understanding that, and so trying to meet teachers where they're at, and knowing that people get the term was shared, they get initiative fatigue, I think is what was shared. And, because when you're in the classroom for a while, right, you start to have this experience of this initiative and that initiative. And there's a lot of resistance to that because of how disruptive it can be, and it can be exhausting. So really understanding, the community that you're working with, and building allyship from where folks are. And so with that, we're gonna transition because we're coming up on time, and I just want to thank everybody for sharing your ideas, and you can check out the Jamboard for more ideas. When we created this problem of practice, we did it grounded in experiences that we've had. So, this is a real problem. It may manifest in different forms, but as I was presenting earlier, a lot of questions came in the chat. Well, how do you get buy-in, and how do you have the freedom to approach this? And so, those are real questions for us to solve and build community around. So as we have a couple of things to do as we close out. Wanted to just ask folks, and this we can do this for a few minutes in the chat. Now that we've had a chance to look at some curriculum that has been designed with a healing-centered engagement framework in mind, as well as an ethnic studies framework. What's coming up in your mind, body, and heart as you move into the rest of your day at work? How did this, you can answer any of these. How did this session expand your understanding of what people need in your community? In what ways might you see yourself bringing what you've learned into your practice? And what questions are still running around in your mind about what's been shared, either in the case study or in the workshop? Agreed, Oriana. Each of these sessions could be their own COP. We have several more, we have more sessions, several more presenters and conversations to be had. So I see that there is a registration link in there. If you enjoyed your time with us, definitely pass this around so that we can keep building and making sure people have access to these kinds of conversations. Yeah. I see a comment about how mental health professionals can collaborate on curriculum and pedagogy. Yes, absolutely. So that it's not just these silos that we work in. Yes, I'm gonna put my email in the chat, so that folks, if you want to have get more information about or some of the curriculum. I'm happy to share if you want to do oral histories or build counter stories like this. And then there's also a piece, I think, linked in the Jamboard that I wrote detailing this with Dr. Stephanie Carriaga, who I referenced. So I think that's in there if you want to look in more detail at how that played out. So that's available to you. But you can contact me. I'm happy to continue engaging and supporting your work. And then let's see. Oriana, do you want to close this out?
This is Oscar. I'll close.
Oh,
out.
Oscar. I'm sorry. Sorry, Oscar.
You know, if you will just advance the slides when I ask you to do so, I appreciate that. So, to everyone, my name is Oscar Morgan, and I'm the project director for the Central East Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. And on behalf of my colleagues with the Mental Health Technology Center Network and our esteemed speaker, I want to say thank you for joining us today, for trusting us, for building with us a community. And if you go to the next slide, we want to invite you back to our series. We will have the next session will be on March 1st, and there will be several more thereafter. And we'll be continuing to dialogue about this issue of the curriculum and schools and how we can use our collective and individual strengths to be more, to bring healing to our students and to ourselves within the classroom setting. Next slide. Based upon what you've learned today, and if you have any thoughts about or issues or real life experiences that you'd like for us to focus on in a case study, please feel free to get in contact with Ricardo. His email is there, and we will certainly try to address that issue within our, as a teaching moment during this series. Next slide. Our network is funded through the SAMHSA to provide this training. And as mentioned earlier by my colleague, Dave Brown, everything we do is free. But the one thing that but the cost, if you will, is that we ask you to fill out a very brief an evaluation form. And if you would mind doing that, it'd be very helpful to us. To access the form, there are 2 ways to do that. And we would really appreciate if you just take a moment to do that. And I like to keep this slide up for a moment and not necessarily go to the next slide to give everybody an opportunity to access the evaluation. But in the end, I'd like to say thank you again, and to know that this is one of many events that we do across the United States. There's a center connected to each of your states and territories, and we'd invite you to look at our website collectively as well as individually, because every day except for the weekend, and even sometimes on the weekend, you can find a free event to go to that's complementary to the one that we're having today, as well as addressing other issues that may be of your interest. And if you can go to the last slide, because I do want to point out that we also have a Native American, Indian, Alaskan Native Technology Transfer Center and a National Hispanic and Latino a center that focuses specifically on those populations. So we do invite you to stay tuned and continue to connect with us for free training, and we are willing and able to answer any questions that you may have following this. So thank you. Have a great day. Don't forget to fill out the evaluation form. See you next week.